Hi, everyone. I'm Maggie McGrath, senior editor at Forbes. The Minnesota State Legislature has a one-of-a-kind power-sharing agreement between its Democratic and Republican caucuses. Because it's one-of-a-kind, we wanted to ask Minnesota House Speaker Lisa DeMuth to join us to break down what is happening and what it could mean for the future of national politics. Speaker DeMuth, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Maggie. It's good to have this conversation with you.
So I referred to this power sharing agreement as one of a kind, at least in modern American politics. Can you break down exactly where we are in the Minnesota State Legislature and how we got there?
Absolutely. And I'm happy to tell you how we got there because it has felt like years in between rather than just a few days or even just a month. On the night of the election, though, there was a tie in the Minnesota House of Representatives. 67 Republicans and 67 Democrats. There was one Democrat, one seat that was found to have been won by a person that didn't live in the district. The courts found that he could not take the oath of office or be a representative for District 40B, which then gave us a one-seat advantage as Republicans. 67 Republicans to 66 Democrats. We know that there needs to be a special election. That will take place on March 11th. So right now, that seat that's vacated belongs to the voters. We can't say who is going to win that. We can look at historical numbers, but right now that is an empty seat. So because of that, where we were thinking we were in a tie, we started talking about a power sharing agreement where there would have, for the first time in history, have been co-speakers, there would be co-chairs, and an equal number of members on every one of the committees. When we went to the one seat advantage, that was no longer needed because it was going to be 3 months into the start of a legislative session. The Democrats who had been in the power and had been in the majority for 6 years were very troubled by that. And so they did the unprecedented move of doing a super secret swearing in 2 days before the start of session. Session was supposed to start January 14th. They did their own off-site, behind closed doors, no one knew about it, swearing in, and then decided to deny quorum by not showing up for the work that they were elected to do for 23 days. They wanted equal power, thinking that we were going to go back into a tie in an election that hadn't even happened yet, a special election. I'll pause there in case you have any clarifying questions, because it's a lot.
That is a remarkable turn of events, but I guess what I'm wondering, based on what you've outlined, how did you get to the point of power sharing and where you are now?
So in a tie, it made sense to do power sharing. Once we were no longer in a tie, it didn't make sense to do that because it didn't exist. So there were a lot of negotiations. There were a lot of concessions that basically were made. And the Democrats, I think, finally came to the realization that the public pressure of not showing up for work and still being paid by the taxpayers was not going to be good for them in the long term. We came up with an agreement that was just signed on the 5th of February, which would bring the Democrats back to work on the 6th of February. So what happened with that is I will be the full Republican speaker for the next 2 years with very little limitations on that role. At first, the Democrats have been offering a speaker in name only, but that was not what was needed for the state of Minnesota. So with those concessions, just very small things such as administrative decisions would be made by both leaders of the caucus if we go back to a tie. Right now, on every one of the 25 committees that we have Republican chairs of those committees, an equal number of members. But during the time that we have the one seat advantage, there is one less voting member of the Democrats on each one of the committees. So we have an advantage by one vote on every single one of the committees. The biggest concession that they made, in addition to speaker, is we have a fraud prevention and agency oversight committee that has just been started for the first time. There's record fraud in the state of Minnesota. We know that, and we wanted to really address that where that has been ignored by the Democrats over the last 6 years, where they've been in power, specifically in full power over the last 2 years. With that fraud prevention committee, that will be chaired by a Republican for the entire 2 years, and the Republicans will have the majority in that committee at a 5-3 makeup of the committee. Those were the biggest concessions where Democrats really had to put down what they had been talking about and realize that they're going to need to come to work. And they had a candidate that cheated and won, and there's a penalty to be paid for that. And with that is now a Republican speaker, and I will do a good job in that role, and then our chairs of the committees, and then definitely that fraud committee overseen and chaired by a Republican.
Maybe this is a procedural in the weeds question, but is that special election still happening in March, and does that change the composition here?
Sure, that special election is scheduled for March 11th. But I think it's important to recognize that in that grab for power that the Democrats didn't have, our Republican governor, Governor Tim Walz, tried to early call that election for January 28th. So there was only going to be a 2-week period of time that the Democrats in the House would have been down 1 seat. That was found by the Supreme Court that he had prematurely called for that election. It's clearly listed out in statute how that needs to take place. This was an election contest, and in the event of an election contest, the election can be called for 22 days after the first day of the session, which would push the ability to call for the election to February 5th. Governor tried to call it early. Supreme Court struck that down and said, no, Governor, you can't do that. And so he was able then on February 5th, the same day that we signed in the agreement that was made for the Democrats to show back up to work. So that election will be March 11th with the swearing in of that new whoever wins that election, Democrat or Republican, on March 17th. Again, that could return us to a tie if the Democrat wins that seat, which is why we have the agreement set up right now with the advantage. Well, we have the 1-seat advantage. If the Republican would win in that seat, all of these power sharing, or I would say organizational agreements to get us to where we are now goes away because we would have the full majority of 68 then.
I see. I think one of the reasons this agreement was so interesting to folks nationally is we are in a moment of tremendous political division, and to see a razor-thin margin and potentially a path towards bipartisanship, I think offers some people some hope. What's your take on what this means for both parties working together for Minnesotans?
We had been talking the entire time during the campaign and even before that Minnesotans need balance in our government. Over the last 2 years, there was a full Democrat control of the state. And so we had talked about balance. I think as Minnesotans got to the polls and cast their votes, they were asking for a change, is exactly what was sent back to the House of Representatives. Because we did come in at a tie originally, and we could potentially return to that tie, this is an opportunity to work together in a way that hasn't been done. As you talk, Maggie, about that polarization and how divisive politics are right now, this is a time for Minnesotans to lead, to say we can do this together. What we recognize here in the House is that it does take 68 votes to pass a bill off the House floor. So instead of waiting even a razor-thin margin of a majority, instead of waiting till the very end of session and finally cutting a deal on all of the things that need to pass, kind of doing that kicking and screaming at the end of a session, we get to start that work early in every one of our committees. Our chairs right now are working with their Democrat counterparts to come together and get votes for bills as they move forward. Now, in this 1-seat advantage for Republicans, I haven't really seen Democrats vote with us, but we know eventually as we get things to the House floor, that will be part of the conversation. In this case, earlier in the session than it would be later. And I think that gives us a definite example for the entire country of when people choose to set politics aside and do the right thing, in this case for the people of Minnesota. We maybe won't get as many things done, but we will get the right things done for all people in Minnesota going forward. That's what I'm really hopeful for.
Now, you mentioned Governor Walz. He has 2 years left in his current term. What do you think this entire episode means for his political future and his remaining 2 years in this term?
This is an opportunity for Governor Walz, if he chooses, he will get to work with Republicans because our votes matter. That is not the experience that we have had over time, specifically over the last 2 years with a full Democrat trifecta. There has been no desire at a legislative level or even at the governor level to work with Republicans. You have to realize in this state, right now, there are 100 Democrats in the legislature and 100 Republicans. That is how closely divided we are. The Senate holds it Democrat control by one. Right now, we hold it by one seat, but if it goes back to a tie, that's how close it is. This is time for the leadership and our governor to step in and recognize that you can't disenfranchise and ignore the will of half of your state. This is a time to work together. He has to make that choice for himself, and we'll see how that all works out. But right now, conservative voices in Minnesota matter, and they have a vote.
I was going to ask about the political makeup of Minnesota. It is traditionally referred to as a blue state, but based on recent election results, Speaker DeMuth, would you say it is more of a purple state?
I would say that, you can use the word purple, but when you look geographically at the map, the heavily held areas, Democrat control, are concentrated into metro areas. The entire rest of the state pretty much shows that conservative voices are what are heard. Conservative voters are what are the people that are trying to make their voices heard. So purple probably works for now, but clearly with an equally divided legislature, purple is the right way to look at it right now.
It probably is, to your point, over the long term, a little bit of a reductive term, and I am all for specificity, so we'll all have to come up with better ways to describe it, because I also, in looking at the urban versus rural versus suburban concerns, there are differences, but there are similarities. So maybe we just have to remove the color system from all of it. Now, you mentioned the fraud prevention priority, but I wanted to ask you, Speaker, what are your other legislative priorities in this term?
As we look forward, fraud is one of the top ones, but it's important for those that are listening and watching right now, Maggie, to realize that over the last 2 years, Democrat full control of the state spent a record $18 billion surplus and raised taxes and fees on every Minnesotan another $10 billion. For the last 2 years, House Republicans specifically have been sounding the alarm bells, saying this spending is not sustainable and we have to make a change. And that was ignored. And so now, instead of having record surplus, we now are heading in the next few years to a deficit of over $5 billion. This is the year that we need to make wise spending decisions. Tax increases, new taxes are off the table. That has no place in conversation or any budget negotiations here in the state of Minnesota. What we have to look at, though, is wise spending, cutting fraud. And unfortunately, in our state, where we used to be known for our educational high outcomes for our K-12 kids, those numbers continue to fall over the leadership of Governor Walz over the last 6 years. Our numbers are going down in reading and in math. We saw new reports that just show more of a reduction in those standards. We have to raise those standards so each one of our kids, no matter where they live in the state, are getting the education. We have committed teachers that do a phenomenal job here in the state. They do their jobs well, but when there's limitations that are put on the spending and mandates and budgetary constraints put on our districts, we need to make sure that we are giving more local control so the schools can exercise their spending and their investment in the best way that meets the needs of their unique students. So we're raising those. We know that we have crime across our state in some of our larger metro areas that really continues to increase and makes it concerning across the state. We need to make sure that our communities are safe. And then any capital investment that we might have, our roads and our bridges, kind of those basic core elements of government, that needs to have a statewide impact, and we need to invest wisely for the future. Those are some of the top level things that we need to focus on, and that's what Minnesotans across the state are asking us to do.
Now, recognizing that the March special election could potentially affect the power sharing agreement depending on the outcome, let's say you continue the power sharing agreement. The outcome allows you to continue the power sharing agreement. And let's say the power sharing is remarkably effective. Is this a structure you would consider or want to see in future legislative sessions?
I think that this opportunity for us, if we do go back to a tie, to work closely together, is going to be an opportunity for us to recognize that we can work together, both parties, we can work across the aisle and come together. Unfortunately, over the last 2 years, it was heavily partisan and our votes were not needed. One of the things that makes me a little bit different in my role as speaker, but also just work in general, is I'm very collaborative. I think that this is an opportunity, even as speaker, but really encouraging input from both sides of the aisle, from Democrats and Republicans, to find ways to work together. As that proves forward and we get our work done, I am hoping the more collaborative style and working for the best of Minnesotans will be something that will carry on even beyond just these 2 years of this legislative session.
Even beyond just these 2 years. And what about the confines of Minnesota? I'm curious, Speaker, do you see lessons for national politicians in what is transpiring in the Minnesota State House right now?
I think not just lessons for national leaders or, across the country, but I have to really recognize that those in Minnesota right now are watching what happens. And if we can make any type of inroads where there is more civility that occurs back in politics, hopefully it will spread out from our state and become more of a national example across our country. I think that is what's needed. We need to get rid of the things that have divided us so much over the last few years and find ways to work together. It's important to recognize we don't agree on everything, and no one ever does, but we can do that in a respectful way and move both our state and eventually our country forward.
Minnesota House Speaker Lisa DeMuth, thank you so much for joining us and breaking down this really fascinating agreement between the Democratic and Republican caucuses in the Minnesota House. We so appreciate your time.
Thank you, Maggie. Very good to talk with you.